This program, of course, is presented by Pro Wrestling Illustrated, the most widely read, widely sold, and respected wrestling magazine in the world today.
All right, this is the PWI Podcast. I'm your host, PWI senior writer Al Castle, joined this week, as always, by my co-host, Brian Solomon. How are you?
I'm doing all right, Al. Happy to be back with you again.
Yes, and it is a special time for PWI 500 season that we're here to talk all about that. And so we've got on our boss, PWI Editor-in-Chief Kevin McElvaney. How are you?
Doing pretty well, Al. I am going back on my half joking, but not really joking at all, not wanting to do any media around the list this year. But there's just too much we have to cover and things we have to address. So I'm happy, of course, to join the two of you.
Is that why you sent Al to the firing line on Busted Open? Is that?
It's funny. I mean, we'll get into it, but I didn't expect anywhere near the visceral and I mean hateful in some cases reactions that we got.
Mean.
Very mean. But I guess it does happen every year, but sometimes I see it way after the fact and it doesn't gnaw at me.
You know what I think is the most insane part of it is actually two things that I just find crazy is that poor Bill Apter still has to
I know he probably gets more crap than any of us.
He does. He's inundated. I feel so bad. And the other thing are the people that somehow seem to think that Dave Meltzer is involved with
right.
Do you see that too, where they're like, I think they're like confusing PWI with the Wrestling Observer. I mean, but it happens a lot.
And Mike Johnson as well. But I mean, at least then that's PW Insider sure. And you can sort of see. But we did have to clarify. And I think Mike Johnson even tweeted something to the effect of, just so you know, this is at official PWI if you're concerned about this, but also maybe go easy on them because this is not an easy.
Mike is a very nice guy.
Yeah. I got to say, that part of it, I always expect the criticism, the nastiness. Yeah. But I think you touch on something that is a little more unexpected and has been nice. There have been a lot of people out there defending us, defending the list. There's always this kind of dismissiveness among some of like, oh, that doesn't mean anything. And, I was just listening to Busted Open this morning and Mark Henry was talking about the list and he had his own criticisms of it, which are fine. And I think, he brought up some important points, but he also addressed, how some folks are very kind of cavalier about the list and who cares about it. And he said, no, this is important. So that part of it is nice to see. The other stuff, not so much. And we'll get into all of it. As long as there's been a podcast, we've kind of gone over the top 10. I think we'll do a little bit differently this year because it is out there. We will discuss the top 10. We'll go over it, but rather than really point by point, go over each one, I think we would be providing more of a service by doing just this, addressing some of the questions, some of the criticism, some of the confusion that's out there about the list. And that's why it's especially important to have Kevin on. I'll keep the plugs short because, in some ways, this whole episode is going to kind of be a plug, at least for the PWI 500. Head on over to pwi-online.com to pick it up. The 32nd annual edition of the PWI 500. I think it's fair to say it's about the biggest thing we do all year. It's sort of our signature. And we put a ton of work into it. Certainly, we take it very seriously. And it's a great looking magazine. I love the cover, Kevin. I like that we went back, another little bit of a throwback with the collage. So that was a lot of fun. Can you talk about the decision to do that versus just having a big picture of Roman Reigns?
Yeah, I mean, I think realistically, we have to look at okay, who's going to be into this cover if it's just Roman Reigns, and certainly Roman Reigns has a ton of fans, and certainly he'll move copies on the newsstand. But we can share the love a little bit and put some of these other people on the cover who might not otherwise get a chance for most of the year. And then the other side of it is, honestly, I just kept looking at that old 1999 cover and I loved the concept of it. And there's actually even a little Easter egg with it because the one person in the top 17 who is not on the cover is MJF. And MJF was just happened to be number 16 on the 1999 cover. The only one not on the cover is Dr. Wagner Jr. And I believe it was a logistics thing, just not having a photo of him to put on the cover. but he wasn't on there. And again, MJF happened to be in the same spot when we're compiling this, when we're putting the issue together. He's off of TV. His future is very uncertain. So just a fun little Easter egg for people who've been reading the magazine that long. And of course, I have to give some credit to a ton of credit to our art director, Laura Brubaker, for once again hitting it out of the park, taking an old concept and updating it and, you know, making it look fresh at the same time.
Yeah, I always like the collage covers because it gives you some sense of the quantity, right, of what we're doing inside, even if it's just whatever, 16, 17 of photos. It drives home that, like, you're going to read about a lot of wrestlers in here, and here are just a few of them. So,
Totally.
Let's jump into it. Brian, let's talk a little bit about number one. Roman Reigns. I think it's a slam dunk. I was on Busted Open last week and also on Sunday night's main event in Canada just yesterday, talking about this. In my mind, it's as much a slam dunk as there's ever been, as clear number one. That said, there was some discussion, debate. You know, we did consider other options. In your mind, was he as clear a number one as there could be?
To me, it's an absolute no-brainer. I feel like it's been 2 years of that. Although, I mean, I know this year even more so. Like last year, it was a no-brainer for me that it was Kenny Omega, but I could really see, okay, Roman Reigns has a really good
closer
case.
Last year, yeah,
right. Whereas this year, I really truly felt like there is no other choice that makes sense. And it's an interesting thing because the only criticism that I can understand is that he doesn't wrestle a lot. I get that, that he's not, but from a kayfabe perspective, especially just like last year when we said, how could you not rank number one, the guy who's unified like 3 different major world titles? If we're ranking this like a sport, same thing. We're looking at a guy who's, the longest reigning WWE world champion since Hulk Hogan. How could you not make that person number one? Especially this year isn't even like the first year that he's been the champ. How could you not? But again, like the only criticism I could see is, okay, he doesn't defend it as often as we'd like. But then who in the world do you put in his place? That's the thing. Do you go back to, I bring it up every time, the Dean Malenko approach where you take, the best technical wrestler in the business? I don't think that would be the way to go. You want somebody who's very prominent, who's a top guy in the business, who's a main eventer, who's a world champion. I just don't see where else you could possibly go with it.
Yeah, and when you talk about the comparison to Hulk Hogan, it's interesting because this idea that your champion has to be on TV every week, defending the title every pay-per-view, that is something of a newer phenomenon over the last, whatever it is, 10, 20 years. That was not the Hulk Hogan model. Granted, he was working house shows fairly regularly, but for the Saturday night's main event and the 2 or 3 pay-per-views you got a year, it was a special occasion. It was a treat to see Hulk Hogan, and that's part of why he was Hulk Hogan, right? And I think, it's sort of counterintuitive, but that's one of the things that's really clicking with Roman Reigns this year is that we see him so infrequently. He really has become kind of the special attraction.
And I think if I could just kind of break away from the kayfabe approach too, for people that do that and look at him and say, here's the thing. Yes. Okay. The nature of professional wrestling, I'm going to rip the lid off here, that these aren't competitive matches. We understand that, right? We know, they know who's winning and losing. We get it. So, but that is very freeing in a way, because if you look at because people will say, well, Hulk Hogan or Bruno Sammartino, they were defending the title 4 or 5 times a week. Roman does it, once every couple of months. Here's the thing. It's not like those guys were actually winning those matches. The more important thing is that the company is considering you worthy of being that champion week after week. They could take it off Roman Reigns anytime they want. They could have taken it off Hulk Hogan and Bruno Sammartino and anyone else any day of the week, any week of the month, anytime they want. They make a conscious decision week after week that this person continues to be the man. That's the most important thing to me personally, rather than the amount of title defenses. It's the length of time that the company considers you worthy to be their standard bearer. And I think that says a lot about Roman Reigns' position in the industry.
I do think that when you mentioned that, sometimes these arguments do seem to conflict with other arguments, right? So on I talked about Mark Henry this morning. I was listening to Busted Open, and he said, and it's an interesting take, that if he was putting together the 500, he'd have Chris Jericho in the top 5 for some of the reasons you're saying, in that he is the draw of AEW. He is their go-to guy for big matches. He's the biggest star. And yet we've got, I forget where he is. He's somewhere in the 20s, respectable, but certainly I don't know that we ever seriously considered him in the top 10 this year. And then I also think about, well, is just pushing a guy enough for him to warrant high ranking? Because I was thinking, yes, Roman Reigns is champion for 2 years because the decision makers in WWE have deemed it so, right? What if it was Omos? What if they said Omos is going, we're putting the world title on Omos and he's going on a 2-year undefeated streak? We'd have to rank him pretty high, but I think it'd be somewhat reluctantly. And even if he did that well, I'm not sure that we'd put him number 1. So Kevin, I'll throw to you on that. I mean, how much is the draw factor important when put together this list, especially at the very top?
Well, I think that's an important point to bring up. And it does, certainly if Omos was champion and was drawing during that time and was perceived as this huge star, whether or not we love the guy's work in the ring. And I mean, we've looked at things like this in the past with, say, like a Braun Strowman and a couple other people.
Someone I remember.
Yeah, so it's happened, but that's one ingredient. Technical ability can figure into it. It doesn't mean you have to be the world's. You don't have to be the Dean Malenko to be number 1. To go back to what Brian was saying, but it's worth noting that Roman did more than just exist as champion. And I think the whole idea that he doesn't wrestle or he hardly wrestles. Okay, you can look at he only has so many title defenses, or he was absent from TV for however long. The fact remains that during the evaluation period, he missed about 3 weeks consecutively. I'm not saying he wasn't out here or there for a week, but he rolled back into that part-time schedule toward the very end of the evaluation period. And then he defended the title against, I think, Riddle on SmackDown. And then the evaluation period was over. And then he was part-time. During the evaluation period, he had almost 100 matches. Now, a lot of them are at house shows. A lot of them are 6-man tags. But to say he wasn't active like that's ridiculous. I mean, he was, most of the people in the top 10 weren't half that active, So you have that, you have this reign that just kept going and going. And at the same time, I mean, I would argue this was a better, those initial defenses against Jey Uso were fantastic in their own way. And they were really remarkable pieces of work. But on paper, as a champion, he really established himself this year, because even though he held the Universal title that whole previous or most of the previous evaluation period, this is when he really stepped out and faced the highest level of competition across the board, unified the belts, and so on.
Yeah. I think, and that was one of my points in bringing up Omos, is that it's not just that Roman was booked to do well; it's that Roman was great in everything he did. Right. When you look at that criteria, just check off the boxes. Oh, he was fantastic at this, fantastic, influence, work in the ring. He's such a polished performer right now that even if he had some losses in there and maybe dropped the title within that evaluation period, I still think he'd be a strong number 1 just for how great he was.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, that's where opinion comes into it. But I feel like it's an opinion that's by far the majority opinion, which is the fact that he was worthy of being in that role. Because it's one thing to say, okay, we're ranking him this way because of the role he was in. It's a fact. We can't deny it. He was in this top spot. He's held the title all this time. But then you have that more subjective factor, which I think like I said, most people would share, is that he's not an Omos. He's somebody that should be in that spot. I mean, you can't name a bigger star in WWE right now. I mean, possibly Brock Lesnar, but again, he's in and out. He's not currently on TV. And for the evaluation period, he was in and out. So, I mean, the most consistent top name, he is at this point the successor to John Cena in most people's eyes.
Yeah, I think you mentioned Brock Lesnar. I think this might be the year that he surpassed Brock Lesnar in terms of star power. I mean, I think now you do that match again, and he's the A side. You hear that term a lot in boxing and MMA. I think he's the A side of any big match. That kind of takes us to another topic. I wanted to hit on some current events here while we're talking about some of these guys, because we haven't talked in a while. We had Clash at the Castle after the evaluation period. Another great performance by Roman. I loved him and Drew McIntyre. Glad to see they kept the belt on him. Some people would disagree. I liked Solo Sikoa joining the Bloodline. And then there's a question about, all right, where do you go from here? And we just find out over the weekend. Logan Paul, I don't know that a lot of people, had that on their radar. And because, it's the whole celebrity crossover thing, I think there's some mixed feelings about it. I think it's great. I think it's going to be a fantastic match. I mean, I've been nothing but impressed by Logan Paul, and I think it's really intriguing size-wise, star power-wise. This feels like a really big match.
Yeah, I think if you're going to do this too, you kind of got to do it while the iron's hot. I don't think, there's an argument to be made for, okay, in storyline, he's got to pick up some wins and establish himself in kayfabe. But the reality is a lot of people, when they come in, they're really, really good at first because they have this rehearsal and all this time to be very good at these matches. And certainly he's a fantastic athlete and he's proven himself outside of wrestling. But I think right now he's kind of, it's funny to say untainted because a lot of people don't like Logan Paul for different reasons outside of wrestling. But in the WWE universe, he is, he's still this hot new attraction. And I don't expect him to win the belt, but I think if he goes to challenge for it in 6 months, it's going to seem more far-fetched in some ways.
I don't think. Oh, go on, Al. Sorry.
I'll set you up real quick. I disagree with anybody who would say he hasn't earned it. I mean, look, you're only going to get so many matches out of Logan Paul. I know he's got a WWE contract, but this is not a guy who's going to be working mid-card feuds or anything like that. If you've got whatever, let's say it's a half a dozen matches, you got to get to Roman soon, right? I mean, that's the reason that you have him. And in some ways, I think more concerning than what it does potentially to Roman is what you might do to Logan, assuming he loses this match. And does he lose some of his momentum? I think the guy's an absolute star.
Yeah, I also think, it's like we've talked about, it's important to keep Roman Reigns busy, right? He needs viable opponents. He can't keep facing the same people. And, they have to get him to wherever the point is where he's going to eventually drop it. I still don't think that they have a definite plan on that. I think they're still riding the wave of this. I think probably for a lot of people, for me, I know, the Logan Paul thing kind of did seem to come out of nowhere. I'm not saying that it's not a good match because I do think it is, if only for the fact that, this is a guy who has such a huge following. I will admit I had no idea who he was until he got involved in wrestling, but he has such a huge following that they're hoping he can bring that following. I mean, that's legitimate. He is more famous and over in the world than any professional wrestler right now currently working in any company. So, I mean, that's the people you want to go after. I mean, what else are they going to do? It's just one thing that I thought was odd was the choice of the location because I mean, I don't know what the culture's like in Saudi Arabia. It just seems like most of the matches they've wanted over there have been very retro. It's like they have this long-term memory of, oh, wow, WWE. Yeah, could we have Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair? Like, that's been a lot. Like, could we have Goldberg 17 times? Can we have The Undertaker come out of retirement? So that surprised me that they would choose a very kind of like forward-looking match like that for an event like this, too.
Yeah, I think what they're interested more than anything is marquee value, right? They want the biggest match. And this feels like that. I mean, when you've got a legit celebrity in Logan Paul with millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of followers, whatever it is, that's marquee as it gets. And again, not to gush, but, when you talk about celebrities who have wrestled, I'd put him at the absolute highest tier of what he's delivered. I thought that at WrestleMania in the tag match and then SummerSlam, his match with The Miz. I was just blown away. I mean, it was one of Miz's best matches, and it was in large part, and it's not to take anything away from The Miz, who's an absolute pro, but you know, Triple H talked about in the press conference, Logan is clearly putting in the work and taking this seriously.
Yeah, it's that new generation now of entertainers who get involved and do take it seriously. You know, I mean, a generation ago, we didn't really see that. You could just tell they were kind of slumming and they were sort of like winking. Yeah. They didn't want to get too pulled into the circus of it. They were a little hesitant. But now, I mean, people are all about it. They really do. Bad Bunny's another great one. I mean, even Ronda Rousey right out of the gate, taking it very seriously, you know, and that's a new thing. Pretty much. Yeah.
So let's get through the list. Just quickly, number 2's Okada. I haven't heard, you know, much, if any, complaints about them back to being on top in New Japan and certainly one of the best wrestlers in the world. Let's talk about number 3 and number 4. They probably deserve to be talked about together. That's the other big headline since we've last got together. CM Punk is number 3. Adam Page is number 4. Both of them off of the strength of their performances in AEW, both of them being world champion in AEW, Punk beating Page. You know, Kevin, Punk hasn't been on this list in 9 years. And I'm wondering if he's gone for another 9 years or if this is the last time we ever see CM Punk on this list. Obviously, after he got the title back at All Out, and then the whole wrestling world exploded when he got on the mic backstage after the show. He is now suspended. And besides that, he's injured again. So even if he wasn't suspended, we wouldn't be seeing him anytime soon. They're crowning a new world champion this Wednesday. Just a disaster for AEW over last couple of days. Talk about, you know, Punk being this high. Some people maybe with some hard feelings towards Punk over this fallout the last few weeks may not be so happy because he doesn't come out terribly sympathetic in what's been happening as of late. And again, is this the last we see him on this list?
I don't know. I thought maybe he was gone from wrestling for good, especially when he didn't join AEW from the get-go, you know? So, I mean, I thought for sure he'd never do anything adjacent to WWE again, but then he did, you know, the Fox Sports stuff that was where he was at least, you know, being critical of the product, but he was associated with them again, even if technically his paycheck is coming from somewhere else. And I mean, I think something we're going to talk about here, and it came up before we started, it'll come up again, but the idea of recency bias. Yeah, CM Punk is really not a very liked guy in pro wrestling right now for a lot of probably very legitimate reasons. But during the evaluation period, you know, probably the single biggest news story of the year outside of Vince McMahon stepping down was CM Punk coming back. Out of the evaluation period, I should say. Filled up an arena just based on the rumor that he might appear. It would have been a disaster if he hadn't. And then he comes back. He lost, I think, one match prior to, you know, everything that's gone on recently with him and Moxley. And, you know, we'll get into all that, but that's not during the evaluation period. You know, and I mean, he was their draw. He was the one who made Rampage ratings hit out of the gate. He's the one who kept Dynamite ratings strong. And he was their champion. And even when he wasn't their champion, he was usually the main event of the show. He was, you know, Page was champ and found himself in that unenviable position of like playing second fiddle to the Punks and Danielsons of the world. But, you know, even if this is one of those situations like a Miz in 2012 or 2013, whichever year it was, where it doesn't look good by the time it gets published, the reality is during the evaluation period, he was, I think you could debate whether it's him or Page in that spot, but, you know, certainly to say Punk doesn't belong in that, like, that's ludicrous. Like, by any objective metric, he does.
Yeah. It is incredible, the 180. I mean, when you talk about just a few months ago, how this guy was the savior of wrestling in AEW and not necessarily before he came back. I mean, when the rumors were that he was coming back, I think there was a lot of skepticism, including for me, about, you know, how committed is this guy going to be? And then he hits it out of the park in his first promo and is on TV almost every week, wrestling, keeping active. he earned the fans' respect, and he earned this ranking. And then you contrast that with just the last few weeks, and he really is like this pariah that I think a lot of fans and certainly wrestlers in AEW, they want him out. He's sort of become this kind of toxic figure in wrestling and in AEW. Brian, can you talk about that? Everything we've seen the last few weeks, and what does it do to CM Punk's legacy? Because I'll mention this real quick. When the Observer Hall of Fame ballot came up last time, I voted for Punk off of the strength of what he did in his comeback, in the first few months of his comeback. And so in some ways, I thought that sort of cemented his legacy in wrestling. But maybe this trumps all of that,
I think it's a big, giant mess. But I also think it's complex and layered. And so I have an opinion on this that I'm going to try to explain. First of all, I want to say right at the top of it that Punk never should have done what he did at that press conference. That was unprecedented. It even makes me question Tony Khan even allowing these press conferences to happen anymore, because then you look at the WWE ones and you can say what you want about them. Yes, it's totally canned and scripted and could be hokey sometimes, but it just comes off as a much more tightly run ship and a professional outfit, and they understand what they're doing as entertainment rather than trying to do like a real life press conference, because sometimes this happens. Now, he should have never aired his grievances that way. It was extremely unprofessional and toxic to do that. However, I think some of what he's saying may be coming from a genuine place of grievance. For example, I would love when all this comes out in the open one day when they do documentaries about it, because I have a feeling that whatever's going on over there that is making him nuts is very similar to what made Cody leave. I really do think there's stuff going on beneath the surface. Punk has not handled it well. I don't think he has a track record of being a man of tact and tolerance in a locker room. But he may have legitimate gripes of seeing things that he doesn't like, seeing things that rub him the wrong way. He comes from the very highest level of the industry. He's used to the way things are run there. And I think, yes, it makes him a bit of a prima donna. But I think like some of the things he would be complaining about with Omega, the Bucks, who are EVPs, and Adam Page and everything, it should have stayed behind closed doors. But I don't know if he's 100% wrong in the kernel of what upset him or what's been bothering him, if that makes sense at all. He just handled it wrong, and it makes the whole operation look like a complete circus.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point that you bring up, because if you do look at Punk over history, there had been so many times where he has been, and I guess this is a question for everybody to decide, but in these different situations, he has been in the right. But the way he has handled it has been so, I don't even know what the word is. I mean, unprofessional is one thing, but I guess he would argue the hell with professionalism. I'm right, and right is right.
Right.
But yes, he has developed this reputation for kind of being a malcontent. And I don't know if I think it was here, I'm not sure if it was here, that I mentioned covering him at the WrestleMania press conference where he was upset about not being in the main event of WrestleMania when it was John Cena and The Rock, and he was working with The Undertaker. And if you saw him, he was like the biggest sad sack in the world. You'd think he was like jerking the curtain or something. And it's like, dude, you're working with The Undertaker at WrestleMania. Right. But that's just kind of the guy he is. And the other part is it's not just griping. It's that when he gets in this mode, this combative mode, he's not above taking some real cheap shots and some stuff that's really ugly. Talking about Colt Cabana sharing a bank account with his mother. I mean, that's neither here nor there. And why are you bringing this up?
And not to mention that he seemed to be going in there with the intention of doing that. I initially thought, because if you remember when the way the thing started, it sort of cut in like in the middle of him talking, like they didn't really start it where it should have started, or maybe they weren't ready. I at first thought he got set off by a question somebody asked, but that's really not what happened. It just seemed like he had a bug, he went in there going, I'm going to blow this thing up. I am sick of having to deal with the Cabana stuff. I can't stand these EVPs. I can't stand Adam Page, and I'm just going to air my dirty laundry right here and now, and they're not going to do anything about it because I'm the whole show. Like, I really think that was the attitude that he brought in there. And like you said, even if there may be legitimate gripes that he has, which I do think there are, it makes you not sympathetic to him.
Yeah.
And it makes you not, because there are people in his situation where if they handled it the right way behind closed doors and, all this kind of thing and dealing with things, you could say, okay, yes, I get it. This guy is the WWE veteran. He's a polished professional. He's a little annoyed by some sloppy things he's seeing and some unprofessional behavior in his eyes. I get it. He wants to sort of like guide this company and help, but Punk is a very hard person to sympathize with just because of his personality and the way he goes about it.
Yeah, he sort of makes himself the bad guy, even when he's in the right with how he deals with it. So let me ask you this, and it is so complicated, right? Because on one hand, he makes some important points, and he's right on, and yet he's very unprofessional and clearly disliked by a lot of people in the locker room. This isn't even the first time this stuff has come up. I mean, he's got this reputation for maybe it's too much to say that he's a cancer in the locker room, but he's certainly not the most popular guy in the locker room. Yet, as you touched on, he's your biggest star. He is a draw. For 8 years, every wrestling promoter was clamoring to get back CM Punk. So what do? I mean, do you keep him around? And if it, and we haven't heard this yet, but if it became a situation, the ultimatum, it's him or it's us, and us being the Bucks and Kenny Omega, founders of the company. If you're Tony Khan, what do you do?
I don't even think that's a choice. I think you have to stick with the people who brought you to the dance in the first place. And I mean, that's, Punk is arguably a much bigger draw in terms of the, bringing in average wrestling fans and all that. But if it becomes an ultimatum, I think if you lose Kenny and you lose the Bucks, even if they don't have quite the power that they used to, if a lot of that's been ceded to Tony, I think you lose a lot of what makes the promotion what it was. And I think you would see other people who would probably follow, and once their contracts are up, they're gone too, because, hey, if you can do this to the people who helped you get this off the ground, then you can do this to me. And a lot of people have loyalty to them. And that's not so much the case with Punk, because he's made a lot of enemies, which is not to say, as Brian made clear here, I mean, there are probably some legitimate things that he has legitimate gripes about. And certainly there seems to be a lot of chaos and unprofessionalism in parts of the backstage aspects of AEW. I mean, I think just look at some of the moves they've made on the corporate side and promoting people into new positions with talent relations and things like that. They're trying to tighten the ship over there. And I do think, to their credit, the way they handled the fallout of this has been really good. I think, they made it clear, like, hey, this is not going to be tolerated. There's forget about interim championships. Like, these championships are just vacant. We're going to crown new champs. And everything around that. I mean, you don't have, I don't know, I think 6 months ago, a year ago, you would have had maybe Tony Khan on Twitter ranting about this. And that's not happening now. And I think that's crucial, because that's something that, transparency is one thing, but you gotta, you don't want to give the appearance that it's chaos. Even if it is, I think they're dealing with a really unenviable situation there right now. And to their credit, they're doing pretty well, at least in the fallout.
He was put in a very bad spot, Tony Khan. I mean, to have to sit there, and that's another reason why it's hard to sympathize with Punk. To have to sit there with your champion and probably your biggest mainstream star sitting next to you and just acting like he has no fear of you at all. I mean, this guy sat there and said, I can say whatever I want and nothing's going to happen. Nobody would have done that. Not only if it was Vince McMahon, because everybody's saying, oh, if this was Vince, he would have done that. And they're right. That would have never happened. But I also don't think that would have happened with Triple H either, because there's a level of respect there that and even, you're looking at a locker room these days in 2022 where most people are significantly younger even than Triple H. So he's almost like a father figure. I think like his credibility, Tony Khan's, it was really hurt by that moment. And so he needed to act. He needed to do something to be put in a position like that where you really come off as powerless and also at the mercy of your talent. Something's got to be done to repair even just the optics of that.
Yes.
Yeah. And the other kind of complicating wrinkle of this is this injury that CM Punk sustained. On one hand, he almost does you a favor, right? Because he takes the decision out of your hands. He's not available for whatever it's going to be, 8 months. On the other hand, it also looks bad if they use the injury as a reason not to act, right? So maybe the easiest thing to do is say, yeah, you're suspended, whatever, to the foreseeable future. 8 months from now, he's available. Maybe cooler heads prevailed. Maybe, you could have that conversation and talk him down and you could work things out. But also, and I'm not advocating for this, but if Tony Khan deems that this is a fireable offense, you should fire him, right? I mean, whether he's suspended or not, whether he's available or not, if that's what he decides is the right move to make, then that's what he should do. And I don't know that it is the right move.
Well, and internally, they're supposedly still investigating this, and they'll come to some kind of conclusion at the end of it. And we don't know everything that happened, but there's certainly a lot to suggest that he was the aggressor in this situation in a lot of ways. Now, we don't know what happened within the room with the supposed fighting and all this stuff. And I think that might be key. But in terms of actually like escalating the situation and making it a giant, unignorable issue, like we know who did that.
Yeah.
There's another piece of this, though, if I could just quickly say that I think we have to consider too is I think there's a reasonable chance that in the midst of all this, ridiculous chaos and the fallout of it, that CM Punk himself could just say, you know what? I don't need this.
Yeah, I'm going. Yeah.
I'm going home. I'm not even going to leave it up to you to fire me or not. Like this is not what I came back for, and I'm just going to go back home and just I probably shouldn't have even come back. Like you know what I mean? Like that could really happen. I think if he just feels like it's not worth it anymore, he may just walk away.
Which is a shame because it's one of the best comeback stories in wrestling in many years. One of the best comeback stories, and he. For it to end like that, regardless of who's at fault or how it ends, it really is a shame, no matter what way you look at it.
Yeah, I mean, Punk's actions outside of the ring give you the impression of this guy who is a bit of a prima donna and aloof and go ahead and fire me. What do I care? But the performer you see on TV is the complete opposite. I mean, that's what's so kind of frustrating. He is such a pro on TV in his promos. I mean, you could question the content of his promos, and that's some of what happened here. But he's great at them. In the ring, he's great. Conditioning wise, for a guy in his mid 40s now, looks great. I mean, he checks off all the boxes.
And coming off of that injury as well. That's worth pointing out. Like he was very vulnerable in that position and probably wasn't able to do all the cardio that he wanted to do. Yeah. I know that's been a big thing that's been discussed, but he pulled it off.
Yeah, bleeding, the whole thing. I mean, you can't ask for somebody to give more of himself in a match and in a performance than Punk. So it's troubling, and it will. If this is the end of CM Punk in wrestling, which it very well could be, it's unfortunate that he leaves because he left WWE kind of as the hero, right? Of standing up for himself, comes back, has this great run, abbreviated in AEW. But then leaves again as sort of a pariah for his behavior. So it's too bad. Let's talk more about the list. And I'll quickly go through the top 10. Like I said, we're not going to go through every name. So I mentioned Paige at 4. Number 5 is Bobby Lashley. Number 6, Cody Rhodes. 7, Bryan Danielson. 8, El Hijo del Vikingo. 9, Big E. 10, Jonathan Gresham. I think one of the biggest headlines and reactions that I've heard from this is who's not in that top 10, and that's Jon Moxley. And I think when you talk about some of the strong negativity that I've heard, certainly a lot of it's got to do with that decision. Can you talk about that, Kevin? Why isn't Jon Moxley in this top 10? And I don't think it's the most unreasonable criticism.
Sure.
Especially given where he is right now. But it does take some understanding the criteria and the evaluation period. But I should point out, even considering those, you could still make an argument for Moxley being in the top 10.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, I mean, a ton of influence outside of what he was doing in AEW. He was a champion in New Japan at the beginning of the evaluation period. He held the GCW championship throughout, which we'll point out here, we don't recognize that as a world title, but it is a heavyweight title of note. It is the most famous, arguably independent wrestling promotion, at least in the US, in many years. And he had a great year, and he didn't, I think did he have a pinfall loss, or maybe one, or undefeated? Admittedly, I'm blanking a little bit on some of these details, but we're already in motion with the women's 150 list. So some of those particulars are out of my mind right now. What I do remember is that there wasn't a hard push for him to be in the top 10 during the meeting. And the two of you were in those meetings as well. And I think the idea was, and a lot of this got blown up on Twitter and taken out of context, and I'll take my responsibility for that, is that it probably should have been addressed in a long form blog thing and not 280 character tweet. But he missed the better part of 3 months when he was in rehab, which we don't penalize him for. That's the same as any other injury. It's the same reason I think we could have looked at Big E at being higher if he had stayed healthy and been, certainly not his fault that he fractured a vertebrae in his neck. Certainly not a negative on Jon Moxley that he chose to do the right thing and go and seek help for his addictions. It's an awesome thing. I grew up in, I'm an adult child of the alcoholic family. I grew up with a dad who's still a recovering alcoholic many years later. So it's not a slight on him for that. That is but one piece of the puzzle. And the other piece of the puzzle is before he had that tremendous return and he formed the Blackpool Combat Club, got a win over Bryan Danielson, and then at the very end of the evaluation period was in the main event scene again. He wasn't doing a whole lot within AEW. He was kind of in the mid card, biding his time as these other guys got acclimated, the Danielsons and Punks of the world, Adam Cole. He wasn't in contention seriously for, the upper level championships. And because of that, to me, it was hard to put him over. You mentioned specifically Gresham, Vikingo, and who was the third that we had in the top? Big E. Yeah. Like 3 world champions. And Moxley did not have a recognized world title during the period, which is not to say he didn't have, by AEW's own definition, that was an interim title. He became world champion in what will be the 2023 list's evaluation period. Do I think it's ridiculous to suggest he's in the top 10? Absolutely not. I think there's an argument on it just based on how popular he is, the different things he did, the styles of wrestling, the toughness he displayed, the bouncing back in the way he did. Yeah, absolutely. You can make that argument, but I also think it's a little bit of a stretch to suggest he should be in the top 5 for that year, because if you look at the evaluation period, and I specifically say top 5 there, I think there's an argument for him in the top 10, but to put him over some of these other wrestlers, it's just not the reality. And it doesn't matter for the sake of this evaluation that he has kind of got the company back on track and, could be world champion again. And has done all these awesome things over the last couple of months. They just simply don't count. And for people saying like, oh, the evaluation period's wrong, you should move it. This is what we'd use every year. Yeah. Someone's going to be mad that we have it 2 months different next year, because if someone else doesn't get ranked where they should. So yeah, I mean, it's, I put my foot in my mouth a couple of times, but it's certainly like, I don't know. I think there's an argument for him to be in the top 10, but I don't think it's as big an omission as some people think.
One wrinkle with all that. So I think, all right, if Moxley's going to be in the top 10, then who gets shifted out of the top 10 for him to take their place? And as you touched on, most of the people in the top 10 held world titles. One that doesn't, which to me is the clearest argument maybe for maybe you switch them out, is Bryan Danielson, who is number 7, didn't hold any titles, and has a loss to Moxley in the evaluation period. So again, this is somewhat, devil's advocate, but why Danielson above Moxley?
Well, in my mind, Danielson's above Moxley. I mean, one, technical ability is one of the criteria, and there's a reason that William Regal calls Danielson the perfect pro wrestler.
Yeah,
but that is one ingredient, and yeah, he had the loss to Moxley, but he challenged for the world title on numerous occasions. He was main eventing shows. Yeah, I think there's a conversation. I think you could also make an argument that Cody Rhodes could be lower than Moxley. Mm-hmm. I don't think any of these are ridiculous or that people are wrong for suggesting them, but this is just how our group, which you guys were both in, not trying to defer blame or anything, but it was, a group of 7 of us, and this is what we came up with.
I agree. And I think it's entirely defensible. And I do think some of it is sort of evaluating the Jon Moxley we have now, who is the savior of AEW, who is won the interim title and then won the world title, and very likely could be world champion again by the middle of this week, to the Jon Moxley of several months ago. And he was never slumming it, but clearly, Bryan Danielson came into the company at the very top. I mean, he debuts working with Kenny Omega in New York City in an incredible match. And one of the things that maybe hurt Danielson is because he came in so high. If you weren't going to put the title on him, he had to lose some matches, and he did. But they were all in these super high stakes matches that Moxley wasn't really having. Moxley was I wouldn't say mid card, maybe upper mid card.
Yeah, mid card was a little bit of and someone will probably clip this out of.
No, I don't think I'm saying it. I don't think you did say it. But I think. Look, if anything outside of the main event is the mid card, then that is the case of where he was. If we were making a call right now, Moxley would be a lot higher if we were putting this list together right now. Yeah. Brian, any thoughts on this whole debate about Moxley? And I'll throw another one in there. I think this one's a little bit more defensible. Seth Rollins, that's the other one I've heard. And Seth is a lot lower. So for what's worth, Moxley is 12, which isn't exactly, slumming it on the list. And Seth is 17. So any thoughts on those two?
I think it all goes back to one of the biggest misconceptions that we always talk about that just continues on, that I think a lot of people just simply do not know or get, that the ranking is not based on where the wrestlers stand at the time that we're doing the ranking.
Yeah.
It's the evaluation period. And it's very easy to because instinctively you want to go, oh, it's the top 500 list of pro wrestlers in pro wrestling. So
who are the biggest stars right now?
Right.
Yeah.
Your mind just goes to, or not even who's the biggest stars, but who are, even if we use the same criteria, winning and all that stuff, but right now. And that would be, that I think is where a lot of people who probably, to be honest, a lot of these critics and people that pile on have probably never touched an issue of Pro Wrestling Illustrated in their life. And this is me saying that. So they have no idea how the magazine works, how the list works, how the rankings have worked over the years. It's a knee-jerk response that I think a lot of people have. And if they just understood the criteria and the way we do it, I think it would be a little different, because it would be one thing if you take issue with that. If you take issue with the method and say, well, why don't you do it differently then? Why don't you rank the people, as they are currently in the business? And that's an argument you could have as to why we don't. There's legitimate reasons why we don't. But it's another thing to just be misinformed and not understand what the list is supposed to be. And I think that's like 90+% of the criticisms that come in about it. And that goes for Moxley, Rollins, and whoever you want to say.
And we can always do better on that end. And I think certainly this year we tried to, like, we had infographics we were sharing all across all our social media. We were saying, like, these are the dates. This is what we're grading. Like, so-and-so is probably not going to be super high on this list because they're more of a tag wrestler at this kind of thing. And that's not to say there aren't problems with the list. I copped to it on Twitter. I mean, Cash Wheeler was left off in error. He wasn't meant to not be on the list. It was a clerical error. It's not the first time it's happened over the years. I'm certainly not proud of it.
No, we're good for one of these every year, pretty much.
There's always something that happens. I think it was Baron Corbin last year. I mean, I don't remember the specific discussion we had about him during the meeting, but for him not to be on wasn't an intentional choice. And I think, we're human beings and it's not perfect, and you can
it's 500 different spots. You mentioned Cash Wheeler. The other one that and this one, I don't know if it surprised me, but maybe that's a little bit that there's this much discussion. Dax Harwood, some people expect him to be number one. Yeah, and he's great. He's fantastic. But again, it's a misunderstanding of what this is, right?
And I think that's what kills me about this, because in talking about this, I'm finding myself in the position that the least pleasant position of having to say, this is why John Moxley and Dax Harwood, two guys that the entire staff, I can't think of anybody on our staff, photographers, writers, doesn't adore these two guys. We all think they're terrific for a lot of different reasons. And we're like, no, he doesn't belong there. And it sounds like we're crapping on them when we're not crapping on them. It's just that, like, look, this is how we do it. It's how we've done it for years. We can have conversations about how it could be done differently, but for it to be completely subjective and like, who's the best wrestler? Well, what the hell does that mean? Like, we have, there's all sorts of things that have changed to differing degrees with this list. And I think it'll continue to happen over the years, but what I have noticed, I will, like, just one last thing I would mention is that the people who disagree for good reason and in good faith, even if they really don't get why we did something one way, are not total jerks about it. They are just like, I don't know about this, guys. And the people who are saying that and who are not, like, repeatedly, like, arguing and name calling and all this stuff seem to have a better idea of what we actually do. So, and if someone is coming from that position and they disagree, then we can absolutely have conversations, and maybe we take some of this stuff into consideration next year.
The other criticism I hear a lot is, and this applies to many people on the list and even some in the top 10, is who the hell is this guy, right? And whether we're talking about El Hijo del Vikingo or even Jonathan Gresham, a lot of people not familiar with him. And if you go down the list, somebody like an AC Mac at number 25, I had a lot of major WWE stars, major AEW stars. That kind of thing. What is the argument for them doing so well when the reality is they're working in front of smaller audiences? They're not household names. And related to that, I think some people often think like, well, if you had, Gresham versus Seth Rollins, Seth clearly wins that, right? So how is Gresham ahead of him? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the magazine addresses in detail why certain people are ranked where they were. And I mean, you did a great job, as always, Al, with the top 10, with the top accomplishments of the period and all this stuff. And what I would say is there are a couple of different, there's different criteria. There are different reasons that you're ranked where you are. Vikingo, he's not the winningest wrestler on the list even. His win-loss record it was at some points fantastic, other times not so much, because he'd be in a 6-way match and someone else would take a pin or something like that. But he's one of the most innovative wrestlers in the world. And people who are actually, and it's, I say this in a way, and I want to be careful about how I say this, because someone pointed out, someone having a question about the list or a concern about a wrestler is not invalidated if they don't read the magazine every month. Like, you can have whatever thoughts you want. And if you're engaging in good faith with what the criteria is, let's talk about it. But someone like Vikingo, someone like AC Mac, we're covering these people prominently in the magazine throughout the year. So we're not like just slotting them in there all of a sudden and people are like, wait, who is this? These are recognized world champions. In Vikingo's case, I mean, just one of the most wildly innovative wrestlers in, arguably a decade, and then AC Mac, the first openly gay world champion, is recognized by PWI. These are big things. Certainly you can debate whether or not those people belong where they are. And to me, we're covering the sport as a continuum, and it exists places besides on TV, and it's not the only metric that should matter. And that's what I keep coming back to.
Yeah. It's also the overwhelming responsibility of making a list that covers the entire globe. Right.
Yes.
And and the reality is that there is wrestling outside of United States and outside of USA Network and TBS, and people like Vikingo or Okada or other people on this list are huge deals where they are, and
also
now
who question Okada at this point?
I know, yeah, but I guarantee I remember when we had him number one, and there were a lot of people who never heard of Okada, and you see him on the cover of a magazine, and we're calling him the number one wrestler in the world. And the reality is, probably the average Monday Night Raw viewer still probably hasn't seen Okada, and a lot of them probably never heard of him. So that's still out there.
Yeah, I want to say something about that because I remember when that happened. And, if I could bring some perspective to this as a teacher, this is something that bugs me, and which is a choice that people have to make. Now, when you see us, what people tend to do, see the reaction I think that I would have, or a lot of other people would have, would be, wow, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, this respected magazine with all this tradition, and they really know their stuff, and they cover this stuff for a living and blah, blah, blah. They put this guy on the cover and said he's the number one. I never heard of this guy. So obviously I need to do my homework and find out who this is and why he's important. That to me is a healthy response. The unhealthy response is, I never heard of him. This doesn't have any meaning to me. Therefore, it's not important. If I don't know about it and I never heard of it and I never heard of this guy, then obviously he is not worthy of being on the cover. I personally think that is an unhealthy response to that, and it's one that too many people choose to have. That's my view.
Brian, I am going to drive up there after this, and I'm going to give you a big hug.
These are things I would tell my students all the time. Okay, you've never heard of this guy. That means that this is something to learn. It doesn't mean he's not important because you never heard of him. You don't know everything. Okay.
And it's never been easier to learn about things like that.
Right.
And we're trying to do our part in that. And I mean, all three of us can attest to this. We grew up reading these magazines and learning about wrestlers we'd never heard of. And wasn't that an eye-opening experience? Didn't that improve our lives as opposed to frustrating us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's how you learn about a lot of these guys, and you go and you seek them out. Right. I mean, otherwise you'd have a top 10 that is just WWE guys, right? Or and some AEW guys. And then you get criticized for that. Real quickly, going back to Seth Rollins, who is, again, another guy who, like, you got to preface this by saying he's awesome. I mean, he's fantastic. Similar situation, I think, to Moxley. The difference with him, and this is also a discussion worth having, is he's sort of penalized for being a heel and being a great heel, right? Because if you look at his win-loss, he barely won a singles match. I think, and I remember going through it, and I was amazed by how few matches he won in the entire evaluation period. But also, it's because that wasn't his job. His job, and for a lot of it, was to make Cody Rhodes. And when you are the top heel or one of the top heels in a wrestling company, unless you have the title, you're going to be on your back a lot.
Yeah, Brian brings this up a lot, that it's difficult. We have to find ways to kind of account for these things. I mean, in Rollins' case specifically, he was actually higher at one point, and I think I made the call to bump him back a little bit. And it's like, whoa, wait, Seth Rollins, who won like 2 high-profile matches all year, why is he ahead of the Impact World Champion Josh Alexander, who had this incredible year in Canada, the US, and all this? There's always room to look at that again and say, okay, well, I don't agree with that because Seth was one of the key stars of WWE. But, if we're going by this criteria, certainly he can make up for it in terms of influence and his incredible technical ability and the quality of opponents. But at some point, we got to go back to in-ring achievement, wins and losses, championships won. That's the way I look at it. I know Brian has a slightly different take on this.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess I always talk about the anti-heel bias of the PWI 500. I it's true. I mean, but again, that would require a complete philosophical shift in how it's done, to move away from wins and losses and treating it like a sport, and to move more towards, we're ranking you as a performer. We're ranking you based on your position in the industry and how you're being pushed. That's a
maybe
total
it's worth talking
shift.
more about that, honestly. Like but
It's a good point.
Not right now. It's something we can talk about over the course of the next year.
I'm saying, like, that's not something that you can't. You got to pick one or the other. You can't do both of those things. So,
Two other things that come to mind that I've heard as criticisms that I think are valid to raise. One is, and this always comes up too, as far as the indies. So-and-so is the biggest star of the indie scene here where I live in the United States, and everybody knows him, and he's not on your list. And a lot of guys from the Northeast are on your list. And, this comes up a lot about West Coast indies or just different kind of regions in the country. And it's a legitimate question, Kevin, and it's a real big challenge for us. I mean, to be tuned into and part of it is the nature of independent wrestling is that these are men and women who most of the time have day jobs, right? And so they're working weekends and they're working within driving distance. So you end up with these regions that are just a sort of a byproduct of like, yeah, I can only cover this much territory within my weekend. And so it is very much the case that the hot indie stars in this part of the country are completely different than the ones from this part of the country. How do we account for that? And what could we do to be better at that?
Yeah. And I think we try to get better about it every year. And, we'll make strides in one direction and then what about this over here? It's never going to be perfect. It is a work in progress. I think there are two things. And I think the first point that you hit on is regional bias. That's a real concern. No secret, historically, a lot of our writers have been East Coast, particularly in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic. That we still have a lot of people there, but we have branched out. We have different freelancers. Righteous Reg is on the rating committee. He's out on the West Coast. He's at indie shows all the time out there. So he suggested some people we didn't have on our radar before or that we didn't rank last year. We have Paul Pratt, columnist for the magazine, who submitted a list of people we should consider for the West Coast specifically. We have submission forms. We have things like that. And we do try to encourage people to let us know about people we might be missing. The other part of this is that we've entered kind of a new era, at least of independent wrestling. Excuse me, talking over an hour, throat's getting really dry. But we're in this era where you can access a lot of this through streaming, through iPay-per-view, more easily than ever. And if you look at the indie wrestlers that are ranked, they're traveling all over the place. They're appearing on these different shows. They have the visibility. So if you have someone who's been the most dominant wrestler in a promotion, we'll just say in Nebraska, not to pick on Nebraska, but if that Nebraskan promotion isn't really carried on the big streaming services and their champion only really wrestles there, how are we going to know about them? First off, we'll see their name in the match reports that were sent. Sure. But we don't really know what they're doing, and they're not really further. They're in kayfabe. In kayfabe, they're not really challenging themselves.
Yeah,
and I think these are things we have to consider. And there's not a perfect answer to it, but anyone who's consistently been left off the list, I would encourage just try and branch out a little bit more.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to bring up, and it sort of came up with this discussion of FTR, is tag teams on the list. And this is a place that we run into issues very often, whether it's some wrestlers being left off. And I know that was the case not just with Cash, but with Montez Ford. I guess that came up. But also this question of whether they should be on at all. We have a dedicated tag team list now. And, it's a conversation to have whether we need to kind of strictly delineate the two, because it's always been weird when you've got somebody like a Young Bucks or an FTR who are doing such a great job and are so important in what they do and such a vital part of the company, or the Usos for that matter. But realistically, when you are ranking them against wrestlers who compete primarily in singles, it might be hard to break the top 100. And are the Usos on the list this year?
Yes.
Yeah,
Where
the Usos
are they?
I'm actually not sure.
I'm going to look them up real quick.
Yeah.
I did.
So
their
Jey
entries.
Uso is 139.
Yeah.
Right.
Jey Uso is a huge a part of WWE,
100%.
a big part of the biggest act in wrestling right now. So it's sort of this contradiction. I imagine he'll do very well in the what is now the tag team 100, right? So well, Brian, I'll ask you. I mean, do you think that it is time to make kind of a clean break between the two?
It's always been very hard to figure out what to do with the tag team people. I think we all can agree on that, at least. It's always been this weird thing because we have it as it's basically a singles list. And so we're ranking these guys who specialize in tag teaming on the matches they've had outside their specialty, which is a weird thing to do, I guess. So, the answer might be, and again, this is muddy water. This requires a little bit of a judgment call. What do you do with Dax Harwood, right? Because he clearly had a push and he's been treated as like, this is a guy who can do both. Like he's in a tag team, but he has some really good singles matches and he's really legit and all that. He's pushed that way. He's presented that way. So it might be a situation where you go, okay, anybody who's in a tag team who hasn't had a significant kind of, and again, we have to define what significant means, who hasn't had a significant singles presence in the evaluation period, we're not even going to bother ranking them. So unless you've been presented on TV as somebody who kind of does a little bit of both, you just are going to be on the tag team list. Maybe that's the way to go.
Yeah, maybe it's the activity threshold, but making it specific to singles matches.
Right.
Well, that's it. And I can reveal this now. I've announced that we do have that hard cutoff for next year's list, with the bare minimum being 10 singles matches or 6 in 6 separate months, the same as the cutoff is now for any matches. On the other hand, kind of what Brian said, I mean, there might still be someone who technically meets the threshold, but they weren't really positioned as a singles person. It's not to say they can't make it, but if they're not on it, that's probably why.
And it's possible that, with the judgment call thing, like let's say you have somebody who meets the 10 matches threshold, but let's say every single one of them were house shows. So just for the people that watch TV, they have no idea that this person had any singles matches. And you know what I mean? So like there is definitely a gray area there of in some cases, maybe make a judgment call.
Yeah.
The other bit of confusion I've seen, I mentioned Mark Henry this morning, so he put together his top 5, and it wasn't crazy, but one of the names he had on was Bianca Belair, and again, it's like, well, that's not the way it works. But another conversation we've had over the years is whether we do merge the two, and whether there should be just one list. And then the other part that sort of confuses things is that there are women on this list, and I feel like every year there's a few more. Is this the most women we've had on the 500 this year?
Yeah, not by a lot. I think it's by 1 or 2. But basically what we've been doing is treating these as the extensions of the overall weekly and monthly list. We do the heavyweight ranking, or singles if you prefer, women's ranking, and tag team ranking. Tag team ranking is completely integrated now. So it provides a look at, potentially we could have a combined list. I think what happens there is you have where there are opportunities near the top of the card for Bianca Belair. There aren't really secondary titles that someone can go for underneath Bianca Belair. So if you have someone who's really dominant as a women's wrestler, who has less TV time, who has fewer titles to contend for, how are they going to fare versus the guys on the list? If you just have a clean across the board, everyone ranks everywhere. So it's a little squishy and weird at this point. One suggestion somebody made that I think is really interesting, and it's at least worth some thought, I don't know that we're going to move to this, is kind of having the combined ranking and sort of doing something separate, because the people who are going to get pushed off are these indie level workers. Maybe there's a separate ranking for them, and there are thresholds that you have to meet to be ranked on each one. Don't know.
Yeah, I think it's great that 32 years in, it's still a work in progress, and we're having these kind of conversations of it. I would say when we've brought up the notion of merging the men's or the 500 and the women's list, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the reaction from women and women wrestlers was negative, that they like having their own list, they like being featured, and I understand that too. So
Sure.
For the moment, I mean, I guess I could be swayed. My vote would be to keep them separate and kind of keep. I think we found a healthy balance that, again, every year needs a little more work and gets more work. And I think the creation of the tag team list also, keeps things in flux and makes us consider things that we haven't before. So anyway, Kevin, great job as always. And I know some folks in our kind of internal chat were wanting to put you up for sainthood for the way you've reacted to, because it's just unenviable, thankless, trying to manage these criticisms with grace and civility. And I think
I don't always. I have my moments, but lesson learned. So it's funny because I specifically did less media this year because I thought it would give me some peace, but then I ended up checking the comments more. So it had the opposite effect. Whereas last year I had this slate of podcast, and I didn't even have time to look at it. So
yeah. And it's cool in the upside of the social media is when you see all these independent wrestlers whose day is just made and career is just made by making the 500. It means so much to them. And that's really cool. Yeah.
One of the best parts of my job.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys, this was a lot of fun. As always, we'll wrap it up here. Hopefully get back to business as usual on the podcast coming up. Real quick, anything? Kevin, tell people where they can get the magazine, how they can get the magazine.
PWI-online.com. You can buy the digital edition. The new digital subscription is really great, and I think you should look at that. Cross-platform mobile. I think I pitched given the hard sell for that on here before, so I'll save that.
Yeah.
But you can pre-order or you can find it on newsstands October 4th. Worth noting also, the PWI Weekly, we have a new premium version, which has some exclusive throwback content in it and possibly some new original editorial content. So stay tuned for that. That is only a few bucks a month. So.
And the 500 is this kind of annual reminder for a lot of people that, yes, we still exist. And so a lot of the feedback I've seen is like, can we still get a copy of PWI? Yes. So
please do get a copy so that we can keep doing this.
Yes. Head on over to the Barnes and Nobles or whatever. You'll be surprised. You'll find it there. And Brian, you want to tell people about the book, where they can get it? Anything else you got going on?
Sure. Blood and Fire, the unbelievable real life story of wrestling's original Sheik. It's still available in print and digital and audio format on Amazon. Still available, doing really well. There's my podcast, Shut Up and Wrestle, which has been just a blast. We've had Al. I will have you on. I promise. I promise.
Keep getting these promises.
It's just we talk every week, so I need a little break. No, but
just take this and put it on your podcast.
I'm up to about 35 of them now, and it's fun. I just had the next one going up is going to be Seth Turner, who's the president of the International Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. A very cool guy, and we just had like Kevin Sullivan and Tom Buchanan, who was a WWF photographer for years. So it's a lot of fun, and you can find it anywhere you get podcasts. And there's the wrestling news too, which I'm now I basically do most of the scripting of it on a daily basis. So it's very unique in the business. I enjoy doing it, where it's just like this daily little NPR like news brief of pro wrestling. So it's a cool thing for people to check out too.
Excellent. Great. And, yeah, I guess that's it. Thanks, guys, for doing this, as always, and for another PWI 500. One of the cool things that I've discovered just in doing this media last couple of weeks is that I have now been part of half of the PWI 500s, which is crazy to me. And are really, yeah. So I came in. This is a 30-second one, and I've done 16 of them. So it's crazy to me and really cool. Yeah. And obviously, thanks to all you guys for all your contributions in there. All right, Kev fans, we'll be back soon. Appreciate it.